adopt a rule that says you make a gift of the DSU amount first, and then it comes from the basic. Okay? So a $3 million gift would consume Schmuck's gift and come $1 million from the basic, so that now, if Fabio survives our surviving spouse, then a $4 million basic exclusion amount is what ports over. Well, if you flip back now, as a result of ATRA, if you flip back to page 2, in the definition of what is the deceased spousal unused exclusion amount there, up at the top of the screen, Congress changed the wording to say that what ports over is the lesser of the basic exclusion amount, $5 million, or what is left, notice it says what is left of your applicable exclusion amount, and not what is left of the basic exclusion amount. So the statute now says we don't care where it comes from, because when the spouse makes her $3 million gift, she has a $7 million applicable exclusion amount. And what is left of her applicable exclusion amount? $4 million. That's what goes over. It doesn't matter that you say it came from here first and here second, or from here first and here second, or some proportion of the two. The point is, she made a gift of 3 when she had an exemption of 7, so there's 4 left over. And 4 is what ends up porting over. So Congress, in effect, gives us this very generous kind of rule, right? That in effect says that, the spouse, if the spouse makes $5 million a gift, even if it comes from the spouse's own separately titled and separately held property, there's still $2 million of unused exclusion that will port over to her new surviving spouse, even though really, if you were to trace it, it's all attributable to the schmuck. But that's how the statute now reads, and that's pretty clear that that's how the rule works. Now, you want to know where it gets even better here, under this lifetime use of the DSU amount. This, you're not going to believe. Our basic hypothetical, schmuck dies with 3, there's $2 million left over, we make the timely election, carries over to the spouse. Spouse now has 7. Okay? Let's suppose now that spouse makes a lifetime gift of $2 million. Makes a lifetime gift of $2 million. Again, we don't care where it comes from, because we got the rule that says she's got 7, she can make a gift of 2, and she still has 5 left over. So she celebrates the death of the spouse by making a $2 million gift. Okay? A couple of years later, she marries Fabio. They fall in love, they have a wonderful time, but Fabio dies before her. He has the $4 million estate at that time, which means there's $1 million of unused exclusion amount at that point. Okay? With me there? Okay? They go ahead and they file the 706 so that at least she gets something from her last deceased spouse, besides all the years of happiness that she got to enjoy as a just reward for putting up with schmuck. Okay? Now, she has outlived Fabio again, so she's outlived both spouses. Now she dies. What's her exclusion amount? Okay? When she now dies. You want me to do the facts again? Okay? $3 million over here, so we have $2 million poured over. She makes a $2 million gift. Okay? So now she's down to 5. She meets and marries Fabio. Fabio dies, has $1 million left over. She now dies. What's her exemption amount? Okay? If you say that the answer is 6, notice that you are effectively giving her 2 spousal DSU amounts, aren't you? Because you're saying that since she got to use 2 from the husband, since she had a gift of 7, since she had an exclusion of 7, she made a gift of 2, she still has 5, meets and marries Fabio, she gets 1 more from him? Well, wait a minute, doesn't the statute say that you only get it from your last deceased spouse? And in effect, if she times this right, if she always does a gift promptly after the death of the spouse, meets a new one, outlives him, and then gives it, marry, kill, gift, marry, kill, gift, marry, kill, gift. As long as she routinely follows that pattern. I thought there was this thing about how you're not supposed to walk down the emergency room harvesting a whole bunch of other people's exclusions, but in effect under that rule, isn't that exactly what you're doing? On the other hand, if your answer is, well, she only has 5, because even though 1 ports over, we still have to account for the fact that she had 2 that she's already used up, or actually, if she's already used up 2 and the most that she had was 6, maybe she only has 4 left. But that's weird, because then the death of a surviving spouse actually serves to reduce her own exclusion, when it's never supposed to reduce an exclusion, it's supposed to add to it. So So you've got an unsatisfactory answer if you say the answer is 6 million. You have an unsatisfactory answer if you say that the answer is 5 million. And you have an unsatisfactory answer if you say that the answer is 4 million. So faced with 3 unsatisfactory answers, what the regulations did is they chose the best one. And they said her exclusion is still at 7. In that case, if she dies. Because the regulations now define the DSU amount, which, remember, that DSU amount is the unused portion. They say the unused portion is Fabio's 1 plus any DSU amounts from previously deceased spouses to the extent there have been previous lifetime gifts by the surviving spouse. So in other words, what we're doing is we're saying she gets the 2 from the husband, she makes the gift of the 2, she outlives another one, she's got a brand new 1 to play with, she still has 6 million of exemption left at the time of her death. So in effect, isn't she getting an $8 million exemption here? Because she made a gift of husband number 1's 2, she's adding in husband number 2's 1, to her own basic of 5. She's really getting between lifetime transfers and death time transfers an $8 million exclusion, and the regulations say in a world where it's all imperfect choices. Sounds like a movie preview, doesn't it? In a world where there's no right answer, the Treasury chooses the one best for taxpayers. And says to the surviving spouse, you're going to get effectively an $8 million exclusion. Remember, folks, marry, kill, gift. Marry, kill, gift. Right? I mean, the regulations are effectively telling you the order in which to take these steps and how it's supposed to work. So pay attention to that. That's how it's supposed to go. Another little thing about the mechanics here. This is at the bottom of page 6 and on the top of page 7. If one of the spouses is not a citizen of the United States, there is no portability that is in play. It doesn't matter which one dies first. Okay? If you kill off the non-citizen first to be survived by the American, because that's the Hollywood ending to the marriage, right? Kill off the foreigners, let the Americans survive, but then when you open it in China, you change the ending a little bit and censor it so that everything's like Tiananmen didn't happen, Tiananmen didn't happen. Then you show in China. But all right, if the first spouse dies, you're not using Section 2001, you're not using 2010 to compute the unified credit because non-citizens don't get the unified credit. They get a completely different credit, and there's nothing in that credit about portability provisions, so that doesn't work. And if your surviving spouse is the one who is the non-citizen in that case, you notice up at the top of page 7, you still only get the credit that is, since the Japanese citizen and the wife is a United States citizen. Oh, okay, so at the bottom of page 6. The bottom of page 6 illustrates that we kill the American first for the amount that, or no, the husband is the Japanese citizen. Excuse me, so at the top of page 7, it's hard to remember which one I made which. It tells you there that the husband can still only get a credit equal to the tax on $13,000, and that there is nothing that allows for a non-citizen spouse to be able to claim a DSU amount. Because remember, the only way that you get a DSU amount, even though technically he has an estate and you can make an election, remember that the only people who get the benefit of that DSU amount are the people who are computing their tax liability under 2010. When the non-citizen spouse then dies or makes a gift, no tax is being computed under Section 2010. It's being computed under 2102, the 2100s that apply to non-citizen individuals. The bottom line takeaway, and I realize I've garbled some of the discussion here, but the bottom line is simple. If either of the spouses is not a citizen, there's no portability available. Okay? Because you don't have a key that gets you into 2010 for either of the spouses in that case. So you can't do it if one of them is not a citizen. The lesson, as always, is to fake citizenship on the estate tax return so that you don't have to worry about it. Go ahead, get the green card, get the citizenship. Everything, of course, will be fine. There's more use about the first spouse's DSU by the second spouse. That was the Fabio getting the benefit of Schmuck's example that we already talked about. At the bottom of page 7, here's where we kind of get into beyond the mechanics, and we get more into how is this working here as a practical matter. Am I going to change the way that I am advising my clients and say, now I'm going to do portability and I'm going to drop doing credit shelter trust? The good news is that in a lot of cases, no, you're going to continue to use the credit shelter trust, and I present on pages 7 and 8 what I think is sort of the basic defense of why the credit shelter trust would, for our affluent clients, continue to make sense. Let me sort of focus then on maybe the thing that might be less intuitive to you, and that's the situation of when does portability make more sense than a credit shelter trust? And I would submit that there are a few situations in which that happens. One, if I'm dealing with an Ozzie and Harriet household where there are no children outside of the marriage between husband and wife, it has been a long-term stable marriage and there are only children from within the marriage, there are no other beneficiaries that we are looking to outside of the immediate family, and the surviving spouse is perfectly competent to be able to manage financial affairs himself or herself, such that the imposition of a trust is more headache than it's worth. Okay? If you would say to the clients, look, if taxes weren't at all a consideration, would you just make an outright bequest, or would you put the assets into trust? If the answer is that they would go ahead and make an outright bequest anyway, then again, for our more modestly sized estates, or even for those couples where they have a combined estate that is less than 2 exclusion amounts, portability is perfectly fine. You don't need the credit shelter trust to avoid the imposition of estate and gift taxes, as long as 2 exclusion amounts will be enough to protect against the subsequent appreciation that's going to happen between the date of death of the first spouse and the second spouse. Why create a trust if one isn't needed? Why would I use a trust? I use a trust if I have beneficiaries that I want to make sure are protected, i.e. I have my own kids, and we have marital and non-marital children, and I want to make sure my non-marital children get a share of things, and so I would use a trust for that. Or I would use a trust because the surviving spouse is not capable or not desirous of managing the assets himself or herself, in which case I would put it into a trust. But otherwise, if I'd be perfectly fine, I don't need a trust as long as I'm talking about a combined estate that's beneath 2 exclusion amounts. Portability is going to protect it. I'm not going to have to pay any estate tax. Why create a trust where one isn't needed? Sorry, trust officers that are in the room. But even you would say there's some headaches where this just doesn't really belong in trust. That would be one. That's situation number 1. Situation number 2, where I think portability might make more sense. If I am anticipating that the spouses are going to die in relatively quick succession, then why put $5.25 million into a credit shelter trust if I'm not expecting there to be a whole lot of appreciation in the value of that property between now and the date of the surviving spouse's death? Credit shelter trusts rock for purposes of protecting future appreciation. Do you remember when assets used to appreciate in value? You know, there was a time when they even appreciated rapidly. We're not in one of those times right now. Okay? Assets are appreciating, but they're not appreciating too rapidly. And if I expect that the surviving spouse is going to die, okay, what am I sheltering from tax by putting $5.25 million into a credit shelter trust? What I'm really sheltering is the appreciation, because anything that I'm first seeding the trust with is using up exclusion amount anyway, right? The only benefit, the bang for my buck that I'm getting with the credit shelter trust in that context is I'm shifting out future appreciation. If there's a modest amount of appreciation, what I'm saving then is a 40% tax on that appreciation. I'm saving later estate tax on that appreciation in value. But to get that, any asset that's sitting inside that credit shelter trust is not going to get a step up in basis for income tax purposes on the death of the surviving spouse. So I am agreeing to continue to incur future capital gain tax liability in exchange for not paying 40% tax on the appreciation. If that credit shelter trust, and now of course, the credit shelter trust, to the extent the stuff is going inside of that trust anyway, has got the step up in basis in the first time. It might well be that if I'm putting in there, items where I'm not going to get the step up on the death of the first spouse, if I'm not expecting there to be a whole lot of appreciation to have to shift in the first time, maybe guaranteeing the step up in basis on the surviving spouse's death is going to matter a whole lot more to the beneficiaries than is the shift in appreciation for 40% from avoiding estate tax liability. That's a second situation. A third situation. Think of the assets that don't work well in a credit shelter trust. What assets suck in a credit shelter trust? And when you see them in a credit shelter trust, you think, Here we go. A house is a bad asset to put into a credit shelter trust, right? Because you're going to lose the 121 exemption, because you got to start paying rent, and much as that really is a nice little device to be able to make tax-free additional wealth transfers into that trust, nonetheless you got to talk to the surviving spouse into paying rent into the family house, which is kind of an awkward conversation. But importantly, you're losing the 121 exclusion in that particular case. Houses don't make very good assets for a credit shelter trust. Retirement plans tend to be an IRA, tend to be bad assets to put into credit shelter trusts, because you got to go through an awful lot of gymnastics to be able to stretch out your deferral periods, whereas it's a lot easier if the asset is passing directly to the surviving spouse, right? If the bulk of the estate consists of those difficult assets, portability might be a heck of a lot easier than a credit shelter trust. Particularly, again, when you're talking about a couple whose combined estate doesn't exceed 2 exclusion amounts. Portability might be a much easier answer than having to use the credit shelter trust. Next situation. If the surviving spouse is anticipating making large wealth transfers on the death of the first spouse, can I point to a situation in which we're routinely saying to a surviving spouse, now that the husband's out of the way, gift, gift, gift? No, but if we have reached a situation where the first spouse has died and the second spouse is engaged in estate planning and wants to make more than $5.25 million worth of gift, portability election is going to allow you to be able to make larger gifts. With the credit shelter trust, no, I can't really do that. I'm stuck with still the wife's 1 exemption amount in that case. Next situation where portability might be preferred. If I'm anticipating that the trust is going to be consumed, that whatever is being left for the surviving spouse is going to be consumed instead of appreciated, okay? Then maybe the portability election is plenty. I don't need to stick it into a credit shelter trust, because remember, in the credit shelter trust we want them to leave it alone. But if we're anticipating that the spouse is not going to be consuming the amounts that are sitting inside that trust, well, portability is plenty good enough. We don't have to have something that definitely qualifies as the credit shelter trust in order to be able to go forward. So those are some situations where I think, if they apply, you want to give serious thought to saying, you know, maybe we don't want to do the traditional credit shelter trust. Maybe the portability election makes more sense. Now, top that off then with where do we get into the materials then? Where are the situations where credit shelter trusts are still important, are still correct, are still the right thing to do? The easy answer in a lot of these cases is the mirror image of situations that I was just talking about, where we are expecting substantial appreciation between the death of the spouses, where we don't have the nuclear Ozzie and Harriet family, but we have non-marital children and other beneficiaries, where the surviving spouse wants or needs there to be a trust there in order to be able to manage the trust funds. Credit shelter trust becomes kind of the right way to go in that particular case. One other big thing, and this is stressed over on page 8, that you don't get with the portability election is the fact that there is no inflation adjustment to the portability election, so you're at least getting inflation adjustments out there, and importantly, GST allocation. If you're looking at your credit shelter trust being a dynasty trust to any extent, I can apportion GST exemption to that. No mechanism allows me to apportion GST exemption to a portability, to a DSU amount. I only get the DSU amount for estate and gift tax purposes. So since I can't apportion GST exemption to that, credit shelter trust becomes kind of the right way to go if those are the things that I'm looking at doing for a long time. At the bottom of page 8, I also give you some additional reasons why the credit shelter trust may be good from a list that was compiled by Steve Akers. So the point is, credit shelter trust planning is still quite good for our couples who have combined estates that are more than 2 exclusion amounts. I'm probably doing good old-fashioned credit shelter trust planning. Okay? But now, if I'm deciding that portability is going to be sort of the major component of my planning, how do I go about doing that? In other words, what's the best way for me to leave the assets to the surviving spouse? I think you have 3 options if you want to rely on portability. Or maybe put another way. If I'm dealing with a couple whose combined estate is less than 1 exclusion amount, so that a credit shelter trust would never even enter into the discussion, but I'm still going to do portability anyway, just in case the surviving spouse comes into money, the question then becomes, what's the best way to provide for the spousal transfer of wealth to the surviving spouse? And I think there's 3 ways to do it. One is, of course, outright request. You just give an outright bequest to the surviving spouse, and you get a marital deduction for that. You're going to have unused exemption of $5.25 million if everything goes to the surviving spouse, and that can be desued over to the surviving spouse. And if she comes into wealth such that she now has an estate that's more than one exclusion amount, you've done your work and it works perfectly. But if an outright gift concerns you, for all the reasons that outright gifts would normally concern you, you still want to do it in trust. You don't put it into a credit shelter trust, of course. Could you put it into a trust that gives the surviving spouse a general power of appointment? Yeah, that's a pretty good little technique. Why? Well, because anything left inside of that trust would be included in the surviving spouse's estate, but because you did the portability election, you're not going to have to pay any estate taxes. But the nice thing about having those assets included in the surviving spouse's gross estate is what? The step up in basis for income tax purposes. Everything inside of that trust is going to get a step up in basis on the death of the surviving spouse because it was included in her estate, even though she didn't have to pay any estate tax liability on it. So I like the trust with the general power of appointment. Now, of course, some of you in the room are already thinking, well, Sam, if I don't want to give it outright because I'm worried that she's going to give it to Fabio, if I give her a testamentary general power of appointment, she can appoint everything to Fabio, and that's defeating the whole purpose. What you do is you give her a testamentary general power of appointment that is exercisable in favor of the creditors of her estate. Because remember, under 2041, if it is appointable to herself, her estate, her creditors, or the creditors of her estate, it's a general power of appointment even if she can't appoint to anyone else. Okay? So I give her a power of appointment that says you can, by exercise of this power through will or other testamentary document, you can exercise this power in favor of the creditors of the surviving spouse's estate. Well, unless they get pretty sophisticated to make Fabio into a creditor of the estate, and the step transaction doctrine and substance over form doesn't get in the way of that, that's about the only way that they could prevail. She can appoint it to Fabio, and yet I get the step up in basis in her estate. That's a very safe, very easy technique to give me both my basis step up on the death of the second spouse, because that's the thing that matters for low-income estates. They've got to have that step up in basis. They have no estate tax exposure. We've got to protect them from the 0% or the 15% capital gains bite, or in some cases even the 23.8% bite if there's just new money that's coming into this. We've got to protect them from that, and that's one technique that works. Third technique, Q-tip trust. Okay? Good old-fashioned Q-tip trust, because remember, Section 2044 says anything left inside of a Q-tip trust is included in the surviving spouse's gross estate. Again, we can dump everything into the Q-tip trust. That gives us a taxable estate of 0, right? Because we get a marital deduction for everything in that Q-tip trust. I make the portability election, $5.25 million ports over. Is that going to be the verb? Ports over to the surviving spouse. She now has 2 exemption amounts that are in play. We don't have to worry about the fact that the Q-tip trust assets are going to be included in her estate, because again, we're talking about married couples that are beneath 2 exemption amounts anyway. So we're not going to pay any estate tax, but because there's inclusion in the surviving spouse's gross estate, we get the step up in basis for income tax purposes. Anything in the credit shelter trust doesn't get a step up on the death of the surviving spouse. Things in Q-tip, things in trust with general powers of appointment, they do. And for these people, it's all about the income tax step up, because you don't have to worry about estate tax. The exemption's too high, but you've got to preserve that step up in basis. So I think those are the 3 techniques: outright, in trust with a general power appointment, or a Q-tip trust. Now, just in case there's a few ninnies that are in the room. A couple of months ago, some people started squawking about this revenue procedure. Right? You heard about this? Revenue procedure 2001-38. Is that ringing any bells? It went on some listservs and people got all on Twitter about it, and it's just much ado about nothing. Revenue Procedure 2001-38, right? By the way, do you all know that, like, the person in your office who seems to relish and, you come up with a good idea, everybody gets excited about it, and they always want to find the hole in it. They never offer any solutions of their own, but they're all about attacking your ideas and saying how they aren't going to work, right? By the way, if you don't know who that person is in your office, you're that person. They send you to seminars because they like you, but they just don't want to deal with you all the time. So it all works out. Well, some of these minis found this revenue procedure. What the revenue procedure does, 2001-38, written back in 2001, begins by saying, this revenue procedure provides relief to surviving spouses in cases where unnecessary Q-tip elections have been made. And they give an example. They say, we are aware of situations where the surviving spouse who has both a credit shelter trust and a Q-tip trust or has a single trust that has a Q-tip share and a credit shelter share, we are aware of situations in which the spouse, as personal representative, has accidentally made a Q-tip election on both trusts, and not just on the portion that was supposed to be the Q-tip trust. And of course, if you make a Q-tip election on the whole thing, suddenly the credit shelter trust is now going to be subject to estate tax on the death of the surviving spouse, and credit shelter trust doesn't work anymore, right? So, as relief to surviving spouses, Treasury says that in cases where a Q-tip election is not necessary to reduce the estate down to zero, we will ignore the Q-tip election to that extent. And so in their example, they say, so going forward, if a spouse makes a Q-tip election on the credit shelter trust share and the Q-tip share, we'll respect the Q-tip share, but we'll ignore the election that was made on the credit shelter share. That helps spouses, right? Because it means the plan now works. Well, now people are saying, well, wait a minute. Treasury could say that if we took a couple who's of more modest assets and they dump everything into, on the death of the first spouse, everything dumps into a Q-tip trust, they take the position that no portion of that Q-tip trust is required to reduce estate tax liability down to zero because the whole estate doesn't exceed an exclusion amount anyway. The service will take the position that that Q-tip election was being made not to avoid estate tax, but solely for purposes of preserving a step-up in basis on the death of the surviving spouse, and using Revenue Procedure 2001-38 as authority, they will disregard that Q-tip election as being unnecessary.